The scent of warm mint tea filled the small apartment, mingling with the distant sounds of street musicians playing in the marketplace below. It was a melody of home, of safety, of a world that, to Yousef and Yara, had always felt unbreakable. "Play something for us, Baba," Yara called out, her 8-year-old voice bubbling with excitement. She twirled around the living room, her long dark braids catching the golden light of the setting sun. Their father chuckled, adjusting the violin beneath his chin. "All right, but only if you sing along," he teased, already drawing the bow across the strings. The first notes of an old Palestinian lullaby filled the air, delicate and rich. Yousef sat beside his mother, watching as she scribbled verses into her worn leather notebook. A poet, a dreamer, she lived for words the way Baba lived for music. She smiled at him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Even in the darkest night, my love, there is a song waiting to be heard," she whispered. The melody grew, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Yara hummed along, eyes closed, while Yousef tapped his fingers on the tabletop, mimicking the beat. Music was their heartbeat, their family's unspoken language. Their father always said that music was hope, and their mother believed words could turn sorrow into beauty. Outside, the call to prayer echoed through the narrow streets, blending into the distant laughter of children playing near the alleys. It was a simple night, an ordinary one, the kind they never thought would end. Then the world cracked open. A sound louder than anything they'd ever heard roared through the sky. The walls shook violently. The warm glow of their home shattered into chaos. The ground disappeared beneath them. Silence. For a long time there was only darkness. Yousef woke to the scent of dust and smoke. His ears rang, his body ached. His fingers clawed against the rubble, feeling sharp edges of broken wood and stone beneath his palms. "Yara!" His voice was hoarse, lost in the choking air. A weak cough answered him. He turned, his heart pounding as he saw her small figure half buried beneath the remains of their home. Blood traced a line down her forehead, her wide eyes filled with confusion and terror. "Baba? Mama?" she whimpered. Yousef swallowed hard, forcing his shaking hands to pull at the debris. "We're okay, Yara. Hold on. I'm getting you out." But even as he said the words, his gaze flickered to the devastation around them. Their home was gone. Their city, once alive with song and poetry, was buried beneath dust and fire. Their parents were nowhere to be found. A deep, suffocating silence settled over them, the kind that comes after something irreversible. It was the night the music stopped. The shelter smelled of damp earth and stale air. The walls, made of cracked concrete, were lined with exhausted faces. Mothers clutching their children, elders wrapped in thin blankets, eyes hollowed by days of fear and sleepless nights. The war did not discriminate. It took homes, dreams, and futures without mercy. Yousef and Yara sat huddled in a corner, their bodies wrapped in a single tattered shawl someone had given them. It wasn't warm enough. Nothing was. The absence of their parents left a coldness that no fabric could shield them from. Yara hadn't spoken much since the night their world had collapsed. She clung to Yousef, her small fingers gripping his shirt like he was the only thing keeping her from drifting away completely. He tried to be strong for her, for both of them, but he was just 8 years old. How did an 8-year-old become the guardian of someone else's world? They had been taken here by a kind stranger, a woman with weary eyes who had found them wandering through the ruins of what had once been their home. She had led them through streets filled with smoke and sorrow, past buildings that stood like broken teeth against the sky. They had walked past bodies covered in dust, past the wreckage of lives that had been torn apart in an instant. The shelter was meant to be safe, but the bombs did not care for boundaries. Every night the ground shook. Every night they woke to screams. There was never silence, never peace. One evening, as the sky darkened into its usual restless gloom, Yousef sat against the shelter wall, staring at his hands. They were trembling. He didn't know if it was from hunger or fear. Maybe both. Then Yara's voice, small and hesitant, broke the silence between them. "Baba's violin," she whispered. "Do you think it's still there?" He turned to her, surprised. She had barely spoken in days. Now there was something in her eyes, a spark of something he hadn't seen since the world fell apart. "I don't know," he admitted. "It was in the corner near the bookshelf." Yara sat up, her grip tightening on his arm. "We have to go back." The very thought made his stomach churn. Going back meant stepping into the ruins of their home, facing the ghosts of what was left behind. But as he looked at his sister, he realized something. She needed this. Music had been their father's soul, their mother's poetry made into sound. If there was anything left of them in this broken world, it was that violin. They had to find it. That night, when the shelter had quieted into restless sleep, they slipped out unnoticed. The streets were dark, the air thick with the lingering scent of destruction. They moved quickly, their small feet navigating through debris and shattered glass. Yousef's heart pounded against his ribs, but he didn't stop. Yara followed close behind, silent but determined. When they reached what had once been their home, the sight stole the breath from Yousef's lungs. The walls were crumbled, the roof caved in. The kitchen, where Mama had made tea, was nothing more than scattered wood and broken tiles. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Yara stepped forward, picking her way through the wreckage. "It was near the bookshelf," she murmured. Yousef followed her, his hands shaking as he lifted chunks of debris, pushing aside burnt books and shattered glass. His fingers scraped against something smooth, wood, polished, familiar. His breath caught. He pulled it free. Baba's violin. The strings were covered in dust, but the body was intact. The bow lay a few feet away, miraculously unharmed. Yara knelt beside him, her eyes wide. "It's still here," she whispered. "It's still here." A lump formed in Yousef's throat. He held the violin close, feeling its weight, its history. The last piece of their father. The last piece of their old life. In that moment, the bombs, the hunger, the fear, it all faded. They had found something the war couldn't take from them. The violin sat between them, its polished wood now smudged with dust, but it still carried the warmth of their father's hands. In the dim glow of the shelter's single lantern, Yousef ran his fingers over the strings. It had been days since they found it, hidden beneath the ruins of their home, and yet he still couldn't bring himself to play. Yara sat beside him, knees drawn to her chest, watching. "Try," she whispered. Yousef swallowed. His father had always made it look so effortless, music spilling from his fingertips like water, filling the room with a warmth that wrapped around them like a hug. But now, in this cold and broken place, he didn't know if he could do it justice. His hand shook as he picked up the bow. The first note was shaky, uneven. It didn't sound like Baba's music. It sounded weak. But Yara's hand covered his, her small fingers curling around his wrist. "Again," she said, her voice steadier than his own. He tried once more. And this time the sound was clearer. The melody of an old lullaby floated through the shelter, a song their mother used to hum while she wrote her poems. It wove through the silence, touching every weary soul in the room. Heads lifted, eyes opened. A mother pulled her child closer. A young boy stopped fidgeting with his shoelaces. An old man blinked away tears he had long stopped shedding. For a moment the war outside did not exist. Yousef played until his fingers ached. When he stopped, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty, not filled with grief. It was full of something unspoken, something that stretched across every person huddled in that shelter. Hope. That night, for the first time in weeks, he and Yara slept without fear. The next evening they found an old out-of-tune keyboard tucked in a corner of the shelter. It was missing a few keys, the wires exposed in places, but when Yara pressed down, a faint note trembled into the air. She grinned. "Help me fix it," she said, rolling up her sleeves. And so they did. They found scraps of wire, pieces of wood, anything they could use to patch it together. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. That night they played together. Yousef on the violin, Yara on the keyboard, filling the shelter with music that had once belonged to their father and mother. First it was just for themselves, a way to remember what they had lost. But soon, others began to gather around them. A young girl, no older than 5, clapped along to the beat. An old woman hummed a song from her youth. A man, his hands rough from years of labor, closed his eyes and swayed. Music was doing something words could not. Days turned into weeks, and their performances became something of a ritual. Every night, when the world outside grew too dark to bear, they played. And every night more people came. The shelter, once filled only with hushed sobs and whispered prayers, now held something else. Something lighter, something stronger. Laughter. One evening, A journalist who had been passing through the camp stopped to listen. She sat with them after, her notebook resting on her knee, her eyes kind but full of sorrow. "Where did you learn to play?" she asked. "Our father taught us," Yara said simply, running her fingers over the keyboard's chipped surface. "Before," she trailed off, but the woman didn't press. Yousef tightened his grip on the violin. "Music is hope," he said, repeating the words his father had always told them. "Even when everything else is gone." The journalist wiped her eyes discreetly and jotted something down. "The world needs to hear your story," she murmured. "People need to understand what's happening to children like you." She took a photo of them that night. Yousef with his violin, Yara with her keyboard, surrounded by people who had once lost their voices but were now singing along. That photo would change everything.
The night their photo was published, everything changed. The journalist's story spread quickly, reaching places Yousef and Yara had never heard of. People from across the world read about the two children who had lost everything, yet still found a way to create beauty through music. Donations began arriving at the shelter: food, blankets, even a brand new keyboard. Letters, written by strangers from different countries, filled with words of encouragement, flooded in. And then came the invitation. An email from a producer at America's Got Talent. First they thought it was a joke. But as the days passed and more messages followed, it became real. They were being invited to perform on one of the biggest stages in the world. The shelter erupted with excitement. Even those who had never watched television knew what this meant. It wasn't just a competition. It was a chance to show the world what war had tried to silence. Yousef hesitated at first. He wasn't sure if they were ready. Could they really stand before millions and play? What if they failed? What if they forgot why they were doing this in the first place? Yara, as always, was certain. "This isn't just for us," she told him. "This is for Mama and Baba. For everyone we lost. For every child still living in the dark." And so, with the help of volunteers and aid workers, arrangements were made. A group of sponsors covered their travel expenses, ensuring they had everything they needed for the journey ahead. The night before they left, the shelter held a small farewell gathering. People sang, clapped, and cheered for them, not as performers but as their own family. "Make them hear us," an old man told them as they boarded the bus. "Make them understand." Los Angeles was nothing like Gaza. The streets pulsed with life, bright lights flashing in every direction, giant billboards towering over them. It felt overwhelming at first, like stepping into a different universe. But they weren't here for the city. They were here for the stage. The night of their audition, they stood backstage, heartbeats pounding like drums. Other performers milled about, some stretching, others rehearsing their routines. But Yousef and Yara remained still, holding hands, grounding each other in a moment that felt too big to comprehend. Then the host called their names. Stepping onto the stage, the lights nearly blinded them. The judges, faces they had only seen on television, watched them curiously. The audience was silent, waiting. The microphone crackled as Yousef took a deep breath. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "My name is Yousef, and this is my sister Yara. We are 8 years old, and we come from Gaza City." A murmur passed through the audience. "Back home, our father was a music teacher," Yara continued, her voice soft but clear. "He told us that music is hope. Our mother was a poet. She said that even in the darkest night, there is a song waiting to be heard." Yousef tightened his grip on his violin. One night the music stopped. A hush fell over the room. "We lost everything," he continued. "But then we found our father's violin in the rubble. And an old keyboard in the shelter. We started playing at first just for ourselves. But soon people would gather. Children, mothers, fathers. Those who had lost everything. For a few moments they would close their eyes and listen. And for a little while, the war outside didn't exist." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the judges. "Tonight we play for them. For the ones who are no longer here. For the voices that will never be heard. And for the hope that one day, the music won't have to be about sorrow, but about peace. The room held its breath. Then they played. Yousef's violin sang through the silence, the melody of their mother's lullaby weaving through the air like a whispered prayer. Yara's fingers danced over the keyboard, each note carrying the weight of memories, of loss, of love. The music filled the vast theater, wrapping around every person in the room. Somewhere in the audience, someone sobbed. On stage, Yara closed her eyes, letting the music carry her, just as it had in the shelter. And for the first time since that night, Yousef felt it too, the presence of their parents not in sorrow, but in every note they played. As the last note faded, a moment of stillness stretched between them and the audience. Then, an explosion of sound. Standing ovation. People on their feet, clapping, wiping tears from their eyes. The judges rose too, their faces raw with emotion. For the first time since the war began, Yousef and Yara were not just children from Gaza. They were not just survivors. They were musicians, storytellers, carriers of hope. As they stood hand in hand, taking it all in, Yousef whispered, "We made them hear us." Yara squeezed his hand. "And we made them understand."